Today, we're going to be diving into one of the most popular, widely consumed supplements out there, and that is caffeine. A lot of times, caffeine gets consumed so commonly that a lot of people don't even view it necessarily as a supplement. But it is, and it's definitely something that we want to be mindful of because it can both work for us and or work against us if we're not careful. So today we're going to focus specifically on how it impacts athlete performance, what you need to know around competition, how to make the caffeine work for you, and what to be mindful of to ensure that it doesn't hurt your performance. And so, big picture, all the different topics that we're going to be diving into, we're going to be focusing on first what caffeine is actually doing inside of our body. So we all have a good idea as like the outcomes and how we feel and things like that, but what is it actually doing? And then we're going to dive into what the research says about it from a performance perspective. And then also where it gets a little muddy, where it's not exactly clear and where it gets a little difficult to be able to interpret. Then we're going to touch on energy drinks, the good, the bad, the ugly, with everything there, with as common as they are. And that ties into the real risks for athletes who are under 18. So all those youth athletes and things like that, what to be mindful of in regards to caffeine. And then what is a smart strategic approach actually going to look like for you? How do you apply this to be able to reap all the benefits of that? So this isn't to necessarily make you afraid of caffeine by any means, and this also isn't to give you kind of like the green light to just absentmindedly take all the caffeine in the world. It's to put everything into perspective to have an understanding about it. So starting off, I want to focus on just kind of in general a reality check. The common behavior surrounding caffeine really brings down kind of the significance of it to where it is just commonplace and it gets overlooked and taken for granted and viewed as just this overall safe type of a thing and product. So a lot of athletes are reaching for those energy drinks, pre-workouts, a lot of times because the marketing is great. It's super colorful. It's selling a very attractive product, being more energy, but it doesn't always paint the full picture, which is where the knowledge gap comes into play. Very few individuals, especially athletes, know actually what's going on when they consume that. What's actually happening to understand, is this really helping me or is this actually slowing me down and hurting me? Because a lot of times when the topic comes up, the oversimplified response from some coaches and parents, especially for the youth athletes, is just don't use it. That's about it. It's like growing up as kids, your parents say don't do something, you ask why, and the response is because I say so. Well, let's give some actual context and some reasoning behind that. There is going to be a lot of support from the research perspective of what it's able to do to be able to help your performance. But again, it's all based in context, and we want to make sure that we have that full understanding of what's actually going on. So how does caffeine actually work? The big thing with caffeine is that it blocks what's referred to as adenosine. You're going to hear a bunch of different pronunciations of that. This is how I say it. So your brain naturally is building up adenosine throughout the day. This is going to make you feel tired. It's going to have you slow down. So over the course of the day, when you do start to feel a little bit tired as we get closer and closer to bedtime, that adenosine is really starting to build up. When we are training and exercising, that adenosine increases even more so. Caffeine comes into play from the standpoint of it actively blocks the adenosine from getting to the brain. It blocks that signal from being noticed to where you feel less tired. And as a result, if you don't feel tired, you're going to keep going. So whether that be on the field or even when you're studying, if you don't feel tired, you're going to be able to keep going. The biggest thing about this, though, is to really understand that while you're not feeling tired, that fatigue is still building. It's just getting masked. It's just getting brushed under the rug. That doesn't mean it's not happening and that it's not there. It can absolutely catch up to you. So the way caffeine works is it just masks the fatigue that's occurring, allowing you to be able to push a little bit harder, go a little bit longer, go a little bit further. And so from a performance perspective, what this allows for is it is absolutely going to be able to help endurance and stamina. A lot of studies are going to show different looks, different numbers, and things like that. But a big thing is, one of the main ones, showing a 17% increase in how long you're able to train and run before exhaustion. That is significant. That is absolutely going to be able to allow you to push longer, push harder, push further. So, from a game standpoint, towards the end of that game, you're going to have the ability to go a little bit harder and faster. Super enticing, 100%, something that's worth considering. Then, from a soccer specific standpoint, different studies have shown that there's going to be up to a 10% improvement in passing accuracy when that dosage is appropriate, and also when the individual actually is receptive to it and responds well to it. But that is also super promising. It's going to be able to help with alertness and decision making. So, the cognitive aspect of things when you're out on the field, it's going to help you be able to read the defense, make that next pass a little bit quicker, a little bit sharper, because you're aware and able to read where everybody is a bit quicker. Then, when it comes to some of the explosive movements from the sprints and the power movements and things like that, that's where the research is a little kind of back and forth. It's not a definitive, yes, this is 100% going to be able to help you, but it's also not a no. This is where the individual response really comes into play, and it's seeing if you want and choose to take some caffeine, how do you specifically respond? But it's not something where it's just a blanket, yes, if you're trying to improve your sprint, if you're really trying to maximize your power, caffeine's going to help you. So that's the one area that just takes a little bit more of kind of a nuance to it. The big thing, though, is understanding the actual dosage required to stimulate some of these effects. And so everybody's going to respond differently, but one of the best ways to be able to understand what dosage is needed is going off of body weight. And so here's a look for an effective dose range based on different body weights for a rough estimate. But in general, if you are getting around 1 milligram per pound of body weight, you're going to be in a pretty good spot. You can go a little bit above it. I tend to be on the side of like the minimum viable dosage. If we go 1 milligram per pound of body weight, it's going to get you close. You've absolutely got the wiggle room to go up and above beyond that a little bit. But as soon as you start to approach kind of doubling your body weight in pounds to the milligrams of caffeine that you're consuming, that's when we start approaching that ceiling of things where it's like, okay, we may want to slow down and be mindful. Overall, though, for individuals who are 18 and under, there is a cap that we really recommend staying below, and that's 100 milligrams per day. That's a recommendation kind of across the board from a lot of the medical agencies overseeing that, just because we don't need to be stimulating the crap out of young athletes. They are still developing. There's still a whole lot going on there that we don't want to interrupt and mess with, and we want to ensure that we keep them safe. So we keep that caffeine intake as low as possible with those individuals, and a lot of times we really don't recommend caffeine at all to those individuals. But if they so choose to go and grab it themselves, it's very important that we try to stay under that 100 milligrams per day threshold. Because as soon as we start to increase that intake and go beyond some of these recommended ranges, this is not one of those situations where more is better. If we overconsume caffeine, this is really going to impact our performance in a negative manner. Because a lot of times what can happen is we start to get overly anxious, overly jittery, and the actual decision making goes down. We're not able to process things as clearly. It really just kind of fogs up the mind, and it's going to negatively impact the body and your performance. So we want to find kind of the Goldilocks aspect of things, that sweet spot right there in the middle of everything. Now, when we look at products and just in general, how much caffeine they actually contain, we're going to touch on some energy drinks here first. There's going to be a wide range of how much caffeine is contained in an energy drink. These are going to be some of the more common ones. Red Bull is going to be the one energy drink that if you so choose and you really want to take an energy drink, that I would be okay with. Red Bull is one of the very few products that actually has been NSF certified, and it's also just one of the most widely studied energy drinks out there. And then on top of that, it's also got the lowest caffeine content. It's nothing crazy. It tries to target kind of that sweet spot of that minimum viable dosage to where you're still going to get the benefit of caffeine. It's still going to be effective, but it's not going to send your caffeine levels through the stinking roof. So Red Bull can be a good sweet spot, but the biggest thing is, for youth athletes especially, every single one of these products is greater than that overall max recommendation that's out there, that 100 milligrams per day. If you consume a Bang energy drink, if that contains 300 milligrams, that's 3 days worth of caffeine. But 3 days of the maximum amount recommended in one drink. We do not want to be doing that. For clarification, that is a very large dose of caffeine, and we want to be very cautious of that because, in addition to energy drinks, a lot of times pre workouts are starting to enter the mix, enter the conversation. And as soon as we start to pile up these different caffeine sources, if we've got caffeine gum, if we've got some coffee in the morning, there's a lot of different sources of caffeine coming in, continuing to increase and build and build and build our overall intake for the entire day. We need to be very cautious of that. We need to be very mindful of that because not only is the caffeine eventually going to get a point where it's going to be detrimental for us, when we introduce those pre-workouts and the energy drink specifically, a lot of times it's the combination of those ingredients that induce effects that we don't necessarily fully know yet what all it does. There's quite a few studies showing negative effects from an overall health standpoint when we start to combine all these different types of ingredients and different things. So in general, I really recommend avoiding energy drinks and really keeping them to the wayside. Same thing with the pre-workouts, just because it's not abundantly clear how safe it actually is. If needing caffeine, there are other methods that I would really recommend that are going to be a little bit safer and that we're going to have a little bit more clarity on how the body's actually going to respond to. And so, in addition to, once we know kind of how much caffeine we're consuming, it's important to take the individual response into consideration as well. Not every player, not everybody is going to respond the exact same way. In a study looking at 20 different athletes, 13 of them did see improvement. 7 of them remained the same or actually performed worse. A lot of times this is going to come down to purely genetics, how the body metabolizes caffeine. Just like some individuals can be lactose intolerant because the body doesn't process lactose very well, the same thing can happen with caffeine. But because the reactions aren't necessarily as apparent as what a lactose allergy is, a lot of times this can go unnoticed. I have worked with athletes before who have come up to me and said, hey, I know that typically we kind of have some caffeine products available. They're like, I really don't feel good with it. It actually makes me feel a little bit slower, a little bit more sluggish. I was like, okay, you know your body better than anyone. Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for addressing that. 100%. Let's pull it. It is not a requirement by any means. And if you as the individual do not respond well to it, get it out of there. Don't feel as though you have to force it by any means. But this is where it just takes that self-awareness to be able to know, how do I typically feel and what is this doing to me? Is this actually helping and benefiting me, or am I noticing some negatives of that? So again, on paper, on average, caffeine can be beneficial, but that doesn't mean it's guaranteed to be beneficial for you. You need to take that individual approach to it and truly assess, how are you responding to it? One thing that you want to be very mindful of as well is the impact that caffeine can have on sleep. This is one thing that really goes under noticed and under kind of addressed, because a lot of times people think when they consume caffeine, it's just that immediate aspect of things. They don't think long term as to how much it's going to be impacting them. What I really want to make sure to get the point across about is the half-life of caffeine. And what I mean by half-life is how long it takes for half the caffeine in your body to get processed and kicked out is 6 hours. So if you happen to have a cup of coffee at, say, 3 p.m., come 9 p.m., when we should be starting to wind the body down, get ready for bed, you still have half that caffeine floating throughout the system. And so depending upon the time in which that you are consuming some of this caffeine, even a small dosage can really impact your night's sleep. And there were several studies where even just 80 milligrams can impact your sleep that night. And this is going to be incredibly important for teenagers, where sleep is going to be the most important thing out there right now at this time. Not only from an overall recovery standpoint, but during the teenage years, the body is just growing and developing. Sleep is when a lot of that magic really occurs. And if we start to decrease the sleep that we're getting or the quality of sleep that we're getting, we're just limiting all those adaptations that the body is trying to do during that prime time. So we want to make sure We keep that caffeine intake to earlier in the day. We really try to limit it later on in the evening to allow it to clear out, get through the system. So when we go to bed, we can actually go to sleep, fall asleep a little bit better. Because a big thing that I want to touch on too is we all know those individuals who are like, yeah, I can have a cup of coffee right before bed and still pass out, no problem. Cool. You very well may, but just because you fall asleep doesn't mean you're getting good quality of sleep. And that is the big differentiation that I really want to make sure is understood. Just because you can fall asleep after consuming caffeine, you are still going to be negatively impacted on how much deep sleep and REM sleep that you are getting. That is what the caffeine is really going to impact. Yes, it absolutely can impact your ability to fall asleep, but even once you are asleep, it's that quality of sleep that's going to be really impacted negatively. So be mindful of that. We want to shift that earlier into the day. And so to dive a little bit deeper again into why this is really important for those teenage years, deep sleep is when the body is doing all that great work. This is a wonderful time period where the body is releasing a lot of growth hormone. We want to take advantage of that. We want to maximize this opportunity, both from just an overall physical development, but especially from kind of an athlete and performance side. The body is doing something during this time period that it is never going to do again. The body is in a prime state to really be developing, and we want to take advantage of every single opportunity that that is providing. And sleep is going to be critical behind that. So getting the adequate sleep is going to allow for optimal growth hormones to be released. During this time, the body is going to maximize its muscle repair and muscle building with all of that. And then on top of that, when we sleep is when the body is really able to process and store memories. So everything that we're learning in school, everything that we're learning throughout the day, everything we're learning on the field from watching film, the training sessions, when we get good quality sleep, that's when the body really processes and when the brain really processes and stores all that information appropriately. It's like with your computer, it saves it to the hard drive, it categorizes it in nice folders so you can access it quickly. This is when that occurs. If we happen to be sacrificing that sleep, whether it be from caffeine intake or staying up too late in these situations, playing Fortnite, watching TV, what have you, this is when a negative snowball and just cycle can start to occur. Because what can happen is poor sleep is going to result in more fatigue. And if we're fatigued, the attractiveness of caffeine is going to increase. So if we're taking then more caffeine, we're going to have worse quality sleep. And again, if we have worse quality sleep, poor recovery, meaning more fatigue, meaning more caffeine, worse sleep, weaker recovery, more caffeine, and it just continues. You cannot outperform or out caffeinate poor sleep. You need to prioritize and protect that sleep to maximize all of these benefits. And then to touch on, again, I don't mean to frighten anybody, but it is very real and worth bringing up some of the negatives that energy drinks can induce because we don't fully know what that combination of all the ingredients in some of those energy products are containing. It can really have a negative impact on the body, especially for a younger, not fully developed body. So for those teens and younger, in a study that was done, 68% of teens are actually consuming energy drinks. So individuals between the ages of 10 and 18, 68% have consumed energy drinks. These things are unbelievably accessible and easily available and literally everywhere. So we need to be mindful of that. Then on top of that, of the adverse health events that have occurred in individuals under 18, 45% of them involved heart or cardiovascular issues. 33% of them, brain and nervous system issues. All of this is just coming back to say that the body is not fully developed to be able to handle the dosage and the quantity of the caffeine that a lot of these things have. So it's very important to be mindful of how much caffeine exposure does your teen athlete or you yourself consume. What's the potential negatives of that? What's the timing of that? And how can we potentially pull back on that to start to bring that intake down? Because 12% of regular teen users, that kind of blew me away. 12% of regular teen users were consuming the equivalent of 14, 16 ounce cans per month. So that's every other day, essentially, having that 16 ounce can of an energy drink. That is wild to me. The fact that it is that abundantly available, that easily consumable, and it's just that commonplace is a little frightening. And so this is just something to be very mindful of and very cautious of when working with minors, or if you have a youth athlete yourself, to make sure to have this conversation to be able to stay mindful of the caffeine intake on that one. And so with caffeine, again, I'm not trying to scare anybody. There are a lot of benefits to that, as we discussed. It helps decrease some of that fatigue, which is going to be great come game time. But we want to be mindful about how we are taking it and when we are taking it. So what's the best way to do that? The best timing is before high stakes competition, not every day during training. This is not something that you want to all of a sudden make the body dependent upon. Because if we consume it every single day, all day, every day, the body does become desensitized to it, to where the same amount of caffeine is not necessarily going to always induce the same sensation, the same feeling. It can still impact our sleep. Like, I'm not saying all of a sudden the body gets trained to negate that effect, but it doesn't provide the same amount of benefit necessarily. So we want to prioritize the effects of that caffeine around game time. So saving it for game days is going to be important. Then the timing aspect of it. We want to consume it typically about an hour before the game starts, because it takes about 60 minutes for that caffeine to peak within the blood. And as we discussed, it takes 6 hours to go back down to half of that concentration. The half-life is 6 hours. So if we're able to have that peak at the start of the game, we've got plenty of time to take advantage of that caffeine to be able to complete the game and maximize the performance benefit out of that. So we've got the timing down. We know what days to be taking it, the time to consume it. We want to ensure, though, that when we do this, we have tested how our body feels and how our body responds to this. Whether it be food, whether it be caffeine, no new foods on game day. You want to be very confident and very sure of how your body is going to feel and how your body is going to respond to the consumption of that. So you want to make sure that you trial that out during a practice session in a situation that's going to be as close to representing a game as you can, to get a true sensation of what's it going to feel like, how is your body going to respond. And then in a perfect world, especially when we're trying it out, we want to be consuming that early enough that it's not going to impact our sleep. Naturally, if we have an evening game, say 7 o'clock the game starts, and we consume it at 6 o'clock, yes, it is going to impact our sleep a little bit, but this is just another reason as to why we should only do that, or really prioritize doing that, on game days itself, because we don't want to impact our sleep every single day. So the things that we want to make sure that we're avoiding is that daily use, to really, if we're using it to get through practices. If we're showing up to practice super exhausted, super fatigued, and we feel like we need that energy drink, like we need that pre-workout to be able to get up and going, that's a red flag that something else is going on. Maybe we need to focus on, how are we consuming our food? Do we have a pre-training snack available? How's our hydration? How is just our sleep overall? That's going to be a red flag that we don't want to just mask with caffeine. We want to ensure that we are not stacking multiple caffeine sources. We want to make sure that we don't have the coffee in the morning, some caffeinated gum throughout the day. One of the gels that we have before we go and train is containing caffeine. Then we top it off with a pre-workout or an energy drink type of a thing. All of that is really going to add up, that total amount of caffeine floating in the body. And again, it takes a while for the body to process all of that. So it's not as though it's going to be a straight up and down. It's going to be essentially a gradual and continuous increase of the overall caffeine in the body. And then the other thing is just to, again, make sure that the first time that we consume a product or have that level of caffeine, that it is not a game day when we are doing this. We want to make sure when we're going into a game, we know exactly how the body's going to feel, exactly how the body's going to respond. And so here's just a list of some practical sources of caffeine. And the top two things are really going to be what I would recommend if wanting to go into caffeine: coffee and tea. It's not going to have a ton of additives in it. It's literally just going to be caffeine. And also the benefit of some coffee and tea is that those contain some antioxidants as well to be able to help the body. So from a predictability standpoint of like, what's the body actually going to get out of it, very high with those. It's going to be very consistent. We know how the body's going to respond if we trial it during practice, and it's going to be repeatable. And you're going to know, again, how you feel. If you want to go a caffeinated capsule, like an actual supplement route, That is going to be a very consistent dose as well. You want to ensure that if you're going that route, that one, the dosage is appropriate for you, but then two, that it is a third party tested product just to make sure that it's nice and safe. And then when we get to the energy drinks, it becomes a little bit more wild. It's not as consistent. It's not as predictable as to what the dosage is and or how the body's going to respond. Red Bull would be the one that I would recommend if you want to go that route. But overall, if I had to say a yes or no, do you recommend energy drinks? It's a solid no. So again, big thing is you just want to know what you're consuming. You want to be mindful of what is the total caffeine intake that you're consuming with each product and throughout the entire day to ensure that you're setting yourself up for success and no surprises. And here are just some common questions that tend to pop up in regards to caffeine and overall athlete performance. First one being, is caffeine safe for teenage athletes? At low amounts, and when we're mindful of that timing again from a sleep perspective, yes, it can be okay. Do I recommend it and say like you need to have it? Absolutely not. But the concern is really when we start to get those high doses daily and when all that caffeine intake really starts to compound. And if they're consuming energy drinks, even more of a, for lack of a better term, concern. We don't want to be relying on energy drinks, and we would love to keep the consumption of them just as a whole as minimal as possible, especially for teenage athletes. The next question is, will I get addicted to caffeine? Addicted is a strong word. I prefer to kind of use the word, and I always hesitate when using it just because the connotation around it isn't always the greatest, but dependence. It's one of those where the body just kind of adapts to the caffeine that we're consuming to where we don't sense it as much. It's still going to impact us internally, especially from a sleep perspective, but we don't notice it as much. It doesn't always provide that alert feeling when we consume it. So as a result, we just kind of consume it daily without really thinking twice about it when we always should be. But what can happen is after regular consumption, if we all of a sudden stop consuming caffeine, this is when we can notice some headaches popping up. That's going to typically be the most common effect of going from consistent and daily caffeine consumption to stopping. It's not the end of the world, but it absolutely can happen and just something to be mindful of. Then, can caffeine replace a bad night of sleep? Absolutely not. The caffeine is going to essentially mask some of the fatigue that you're going to experience from that poor night of sleep. But you're not going to be able to make up all the benefits that you would have gotten from a good night's sleep. From a muscle recovery standpoint, from an overall cognitive and memory standpoint, you cannot make that up. And so while yes, the caffeine can help you get through the day, it's not going to all of a sudden boost your performance more than what you would have gotten with that sleep. And because you didn't get the adaptation overnight, because your sleep was a little bit more poor, you're going to likely just plateau your overall training gains and improvements. You cannot out caffeinate poor sleep. You need to prioritize that sleep if you really want to improve and perform your best. Then, does it work the same for everybody? No. The straight up answer is no. Everybody responds differently to essentially everything, but especially caffeine. This is one of those situations where genetics comes into play. How your body processes, how quickly your body processes the caffeine is going to be kind of genetic. It's not necessarily something that you can train or anything like that. And so while we have the recommendations of when and what to be taking from a caffeine perspective, you need to listen to your body. You know your body better than anyone, and you need to be able to test it in practice, see how you respond before putting it into practice in games. And then, is caffeine banned in sports? Overall, no. A while ago, it was. It's just kind of like a little bit of a blanket statement. Now there's essentially like a dosage that can be flagged from the World Anti-Doping Agency. But to hit the dosage that's going to get flagged, you essentially need to consume probably like 2 pots of coffee within a span of an hour. No one's really going to be doing that. So unless you are just absolutely supplementing and consuming copious amounts of caffeine pretty quickly, it's not going to cause any banned substance alerts or testing positive for any of those tests. So after all of this, what to take away? What are some of the action items on this one? And really, the big thing is just kind of a little bit of a self-assessment. Are you using energy drinks regularly? The big thing is making sure that you start to track what are all the caffeine containing products that you consume in a day? How much caffeine is that in total? And how does that compare to the recommended dosage? Then the other thing is, do you want to try it strategically? If you haven't been using caffeine and you're a little curious on it, we want to make sure that we do it during practice first. No new foods, no new supplements, no new products on game days. Do it during practice, see how your body responds. And then using caffeine before evening practice. You want to be mindful and just think through. Check the timing of any time that you're consuming caffeine to your sleep window. Use that 6-hour half-life as your guide. Be very mindful and intentional about when you are having caffeine. Don't just blanketly and blindly consume it, thinking it's always going to be beneficial. So ask yourself these questions. Find one particular situation or item that really jumps out to you and focus on that a little bit. Really start to figure out, how is your caffeine intake? How is it in line with your overall performance? And is there anything that needs to be adjusted to make sure that you're not unintentionally harming your performance?